Hello, welcome. I am Tracy Francis, the Festival Director of the Cascade Festival of African Films, and I'm here with Ekwa, the Director of Farewell Amor, our closing night film. Hello, Ekwa.
Hi, nice to see you again.
And where are you zooming us from?
I am currently zooming in from Brooklyn, New York.
Awesome, awesome. Well, nice to see you on the other side of the country.
Exactly. Nice to be seen.
Yeah, well, we're so excited to have your this feature here, especially after, we've had a lot of suspense after your short film of like what's going to happen. Are they going to get back together? Are they going to we don't like, I've been, I haven't slept since I watched a short film really. I just
Oh, I'm
what's going
so
to
sorry.
happen.
It's been several years.
Several sleepless years waiting for this.
Well, finally, I'm able to provide some rest for you. I'm glad.
Thank you. I'd love to just start just to kind of learn a little bit more about you and your filmmaking career. How did you get into filmmaking? Why did you get into filmmaking?
Yeah,
Yeah.
all great questions. I decided at a very young age that I wanted to be a filmmaker, and unlike many of my colleagues that I met in film school who came to film school because of their love of cinema and sort of what it meant to them and the representation that they saw and all of those different things. I had the complete opposite experience where I grew up in Kenya in East Africa in the 80s and 90s. And during that period, there was no representation in film and media of African people. You know, all of our shows were imported. The closest we had to just something with black people was like the Cosby Show that showed every so often, but really it was just the news and like one or two slapstick comedy type shows. And it really, really irked me as a young person because I grew up around such lively, interesting, funny, colorful people all the time, just as regular, everyday folks in my life, my family, my friends. And those were never reflected anywhere. And I just found it mind boggling. So I complained about it a lot as a child. And my dad, who was an artist, in finally just got fed up with the complaining and was like, all right, fine, well then learn how to make films and make your own films. And I was like, I will. So I went to film school not knowing anything about what that actually entailed, but it was just sort of like, I'm here to make films, damn it. And it was, I learned how to make, like physically how to make films, which is great. Unfortunately, through my 4 years of undergrad, um, I mean, this was pre digital, pre YouTube, pre sort of being able to connect with the world in the way that we do now. And so none of my teachers, none of my colleagues had any idea of the kinds of stories that I was trying to tell either, because that did not fit with what they had known or seen as African culture or representation. Um, which was nothing. So, which is also really mind boggling because East Africa in particular has been used as a location site for big Hollywood films for decades, you know, since going back into the 30s and 40s. But you never see any African people in any of those films. And so by the end of my undergrad career, I was pretty disappointed and feeling very hopeless about my really to sort of taking this on because I couldn't communicate with any of, you know, my teachers or the people that I thought I was making films for. And it wasn't until my senior year in the Africana Studies department, one of the professors was offering a class in African cinema. And I got to discover African filmmakers who had been working for decades. And I'd never heard of these people because most of their films are shown in European festivals. And at that time in North America, I think your festival and New York African Film Festival were the two places on the entire, you know, continent of the USA that showed African cinema. So I'd never even heard of these things. And that was what kept me as a filmmaker, you know. So I was decided to be a filmmaker, you know, out of the sort of opposition to what I was fed as a young person. And I decided to stay a filmmaker because I learned about other African filmmakers.
That's great. Wonderful. And I'm glad
Yeah.
that our festival served as some inspiration as well.
Amen. Yeah.
Yeah. And so so you moved to the US for college then. Is that,
Yes.
yeah. And if you mostly have lived here since college?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I've gone back every so often. Most of my professional work has actually happened on the continent up to this point. Um, where, I mean, my first gig out of college was a TV show that I wrote, and I got to showrun um, in Kenya. And it was the first original sort of 1 hour or hour long local series that was a huge failure and got canceled because I had terrible producers and they ran away with all our money. But it was a wonderful experience in terms, especially coming out of school. And, I also went to school where we were learning on celluloid film. And just, they were just beginning to introduce digital, but it was a very sort of like, we don't trust that. Nobody does digital. What is that kooky stuff, And, so it was the first time getting to shoot on digital. So it was a wonderful re-education for me, because basically what happened is by the time I graduated film school, all of the instruments, all of the technology that I had learned on pretty much didn't exist in the industry any longer. And so I would have had to go back to school and learn again, which, if you know anything about what NYU costs to go to school, that's not an option. So I got to learn. I got to learn on set, and the people that I worked with had worked on all of these huge, Last King of Scotland and Constant Gardener and Lara Croft Tomb Raider, they were well above my, skill set at that time. And I got to practice working with actors for 5 months, 6 months, which, I mean, that's the thing that's really hard about directing in particular. I mean, there's a lot of other set jobs that you can practice and perfect your skill without having to pay money out of your pocket. As a writer, you can sit at home and write a bunch of scripts and read other people's scripts and get better at it. As a cinematographer, you can work on other people's, or take your own pictures, do your own little thing, especially if you have digital cameras now. At that time we didn't, right? Or sound, or there's certain skills that you can develop on somebody else's project. You can practice with other people's money. But as a director, you sort of have to have people trust you in order to invest in your idea and give you a bunch of money to make it. And that's really hard to do coming out of school. Nobody gets a film job or directing job right out of school just because you went to a particular school and you have a certificate to show that you went there. That doesn't happen. So that was my ability to sort of practice for a while, and then come back here and try and figure out how to get into the industry in the US.
And speaking of someone giving you lots of money to make a film, so this particular film, right, you had that short film first that kind of helps segue and lead you into this feature. Can you
Right.
talk a little bit about that process, both producing wise and also just story wise? Did you have this whole story in mind when you made the short, or did you make the short and then the rest of the story developed later?
It's a little bit of both. I knew I wanted to tell a story about this family that was reuniting after several years of separation. I didn't know exactly how the story would look or what the setup would be or anything like that, but I knew that was generally sort of the premise of the story. Um, but as I said, sort of getting somebody to give me $1 million to make a film. There's always the like, oh, but you've never made a film before. You've never made a feature before. I don't know if that's going to work, but it's like, I mean, I need to make a feature in order to make a feature. There's no other way around it. So this was my third short that I was doing. I a second short that also showed at CFAF a while back, which was a comedy, and it had won a cash prize at a festival. And part of the stipulation for that cash prize was to shoot a short film that would show the following year at the same festival. And so, knowing that I had this feature story in mind, my producer and I decided that we should make a short as a proof of concept. But in my mind at the time, I was also thinking like, oh, it could be a continuation. I could just get the same actors and we could, you know, sort of just have it be a part of the main story. So I decided to make it the moment before. It was a very tiny budget, so we didn't have money for an airport or anything like that. And I just needed like, all right, the smallest thing I can do is like 2 actors, 1 location, 1 day of shooting, and that's it. And so we did Farewell Amor, which is the moment before he goes to the airport to pick up his family, where he's saying goodbye to the girlfriend and sort of where do we leave him off there, with the anticipation that when we go into the future, we'd be able to continue the story.
Wonderful. And what inspired this story for you? I mean, it's I mean, it's an immigrant story and all that, but it's such a specific way into that immigrant story. It's not your stereotypical, not that there is stereotypical immigrant stories, but you know, it's not the story we hear very often.
Right.
It's very different.
Yeah, it, you know, it isn't. And yet now that I've made it, I've heard so many versions of this story now that I'm just like, where are all these people? Um, and you know, just like different setups of, yeah, I left my kids behind, or like I came over with my husband, or my husband, you know, just, it's really quite rampant, and not just with Africans either. It's, you know, people from all cultures and backgrounds who've had these family separation things. But I didn't know that initially. Initially, for me, the inspiration was an aunt and an uncle of mine who were married in Tanzania. My family's from Tanzania. So we're married in Tanzania in the mid 90s. And my uncle got a student visa to come to school in the US, came with every intention of bringing his wife. And at that point, they had a 5-month-old behind him. And to this day, have been stuck in an endless cycle of applying for visas, getting rejections, applying, getting rejections. And they remain hopeful that one day they will be reunited, it will work out, it's gonna, you know, but it's changed them. You know, I've seen mostly from my aunt's side, the kind of the person that she's had to turn into in order to stay hopeful that this thing will actually work, what my cousin has turned into in order to stay hopeful that one day he'll meet his father. Um, and so that was sort of the inspiration of like, well, what happens if this visa is no longer the issue and they finally are able to, okay, go ahead, be a family now. Where do you begin at that point? Where do you begin to meet each other? Or, you know, and I had this image of my uncle at the airport in the arrivals hall waiting for them to show up. And you know, would he recognize them? He's probably nervous that like, you know, will she look different? Will she look the same? Do I look good enough? What am I wearing? What do I smell like? What are we going to eat for dinner? Where am I going to take them? Should I give them a tour of the city? You know, whatever it is, like all of these questions going through his mind and then taking it from there. So yeah, that was the inspiration for it.
I mean, I think those kinds of stories, the sustaining hope and commitment for that long is
Yeah.
just as on a human level, that's just amazing that someone can sustain that for so long without just giving up or moving on, or, you know, and actually try. Like what I love about this movie is that they really try. Like they are, you know, he could have
Yeah.
easily been like, no, I'm good. I have a girlfriend. I'm done. You get your own apartment. I'll like whatever. But they really make a go of it and like full on try to become a family. And I think that's so beautiful and messy and gorgeous. Very messy.
Yeah. It could be worse.
It could be worse. Yeah. I love that. Also, I loved your approach to directing on this with the different perspectives, and we seeing the different sides of the characters throughout. Because I remember, as the first time I watched it, I know I didn't like certain characters at first. I was like, I don't know about her. I'm like, that little girl is kind of a brat, or the mom's kind of weird. But then as soon as I saw from their perspective, right, it's just like, oh, that's what's going on with them. That's what, you know, and like my empathy for those characters completely changed as once I was able to see it through. I mean, well, that's what film does, right? It helps us to see things through other people's perspectives.
Yeah.
How, you know, how that idea came to you, why you approached the film in this way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, after we had finished the short, and was starting to work on the feature, because the short was about Walter's story and him saying goodbye to the girlfriend before he goes to the airport, his story was sort of the freshest in my mind. So I started writing his story and then was kind of like, well, I mean, we've seen stories about the guy who has a girlfriend, and he's trying to choose what to do, and like, that's not interesting. So, I mean, but it is because he is actually really trying to have a relationship with his wife, and he did tell the girlfriend from the get-go that he wasn't, that he was married. It's not like he posed as a single person and then was like, hey, surprise, I'm not. um but still, it's just kind of like, I don't know if this is the best thing. Maybe I'll do it from the daughter's perspective. So I thought maybe doing it from Sylvia's perspective, but because she has a dance element, sort of like a hip hop dance element, there's a way in which young Black teens doing dance, hip hop type styles of dance becomes like, oh yeah, we've seen that movie. It's a hip hop movie, and it's a made for TV movie automatically, and that's not what I wanted for the film, because I felt like this was addressing like just much more serious issues. So then I was like, well, okay, well, maybe let's see what happens if I just do the two of them, the father and the daughter, because they have this, relationship where they don't actually know each other at all. At least, husband and wife have some sort of history together, but these two don't. And so I initially just wrote it from the two perspectives. And then about 8 months into the process, it became abundantly clear that both of their stories hinged so much on Esther's story, and it wouldn't be possible or make sense to tell the story without telling Esther's story, because she was coming out as such a villain. Um, and I wanted, I just thought it was really unique that, we have such an expectation of what their feelings are at this moment. Like, yay, it's worked, you're together, all your problems are solved, woohoo, the end. And it's not. Not only is it not the end, but each of them are experiencing the one event in a very different way because of their personal baggage that each one of them has. And I didn't want to sacrifice one person's experience over the others, because they each have such unique experiences. So I added Esther's story at the end and was just like, okay, well, let's see what happens if we have all three of their stories. And then you get to see how each person is experiencing this one happy event.
I almost also wanted to see the girlfriend's
And then
perspective. Can you make a follow-up short just for me where I can see her perspective? Just
honey, you and many others, there is definitely an official Team Linda. Like, what happened to Linda? We'll have to figure out how to get more of her story. And she did such a great job. I loved working with Nana Mensah as that character. And she's the one actor I was able to bring over from the short. Our Walter from the short is a wonderful actor and therefore was booked on Broadway for an entire year. So we weren't able to work with him, even though I adored Ntare and he's a good friend. And, he did such an incredible job in the feature as Walter. But Nana, she had a very small part in the feature, but it was extremely memorable. So I will pass along your concerns.
thank you. Yeah, let the filmmaker know, please, that I enjoyed
Yes,
the story.
will do.
Can you talk also a little bit about your choice to about where they came from? So the family came from Angola, right? And what inspired that for you?
Yeah, Angola is primarily because of the music and the dance, which I just love from Angola. I've never been to Angola. I do not speak Portuguese. But I did spend several years learning and practicing Angolan dance, specifically Kizomba and Kuduro. Kizomba and Semba, which are the styles that Walter practices in the film, and Kuduro, which is the style that Sylvia practices in the film. And through those dance classes and conferences that I would go to, I just learned a lot about the culture and the significance of Angola on the continent as this place where, a big part of the Cold War was fought in Angola. because of all of these, the USSR is supporting the Cubans, who are supporting, this particular party, Agustino Nieto, and the Americans are supporting the South Africans who are, against the USSR. So it's like all of these external forces, and they ended up having 30 years of a civil war because of all of this other stuff, and also because Angola has incredible wealth in terms of diamonds and gas and all of these different things. Um, Incredible wealth, but also has some of the most poverty in the country as well, and just kind of what's happened to a people that I certainly did not grow up hearing much about Angola ever, even though we border them fairly closely in Tanzania. And most of that is because of language. But I did grow up listening to a lot of Congolese music, which is very similar to what they play in Angola. So I just thought it was an interesting way into their characters to use the music and the dance in particular as a metaphor for what they're struggling with. Kizomba dance, Kizomba is very beautiful, sensual couples dance. It's very close, but it requires quite a bit of connection in order to know what your partner wants you to do, because it doesn't have a regular foot pattern to it. And so I just thought it was interesting for a couple that is disconnected and quite literally out of step to be trying to find their step together in order to know which way to lead or follow. And for Sylvia, I mean, Kuduro on the surface looks like, any kind of typical hip hop style dance, and it is in some ways, but the things that they talk about in Kuduro music are just like really, I mean, it's kind of the one platform that young people have to talk about the things that concern them, from the economics, the lack of jobs, the domestic violence, whatever it is. And so there are all of these really fun dances that are really about a whole bunch of other social issues that people are concerned about. And as a young African girl who's in this situation between her parents, there's this father that she kind of is supposed to be idolizing, but she's also never met him before, and she wouldn't be the kind of she wouldn't have been raised with the option of having a tantrum, for example, if she's upset about something. And therefore, how does she express herself? So dance becomes a way for them to express the things that are under the surface, because on the surface they're being very polite and careful with each other and just really grateful to God that everything has worked out, but they're dealing with all these other things. So I just wanted to use those particular dances, and their music is so amazing. Like, why not?
And I love how that's kind of threaded through all the characters throughout. And yeah, there is that, that is a way to kind of express all that underneath stuff that they aren't able to say.
Yeah.
One scene that really struck me was the intimate scene, we'll call it, between
Yes.
for all the watching this interview, the intimate scene between the parents.
Yes.
Just
That one.
just like just the uncomfortability and the like, and this like I can't think of the word, but just yeah.
You know, that scene means a lot to me. I'm glad that it struck you, for a number of reasons. One, how often do you ever get to see a middle-aged Black African woman, having consensual sexual intimacy with somebody and actually having pleasure? Like, never. Um, and also just like that character in particular, like being able, this is the one thing that the connection that she's been dying to have for so long, and sort of the way that it plays out afterwards is a little bit tragic, but I wanted to give her that, I wanted to give her that one gift, give us all that one gift of having Esther in ecstasy, which I just thought was really wonderful, because we never ever get to see that. I certainly haven't. And I think there should be more.
And with her character, can you talk a bit about? I mean, it seems just when we hear about how she was when they first got married to how she is now, it seems like she's undergone quite a personal and moral transformation in her belief system. Um, Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that character's journey through?
Yeah. I mean, she's a compilation of a number of aunties, not just the one aunt who inspired the story or whose circumstances inspired the story, but there's a way in which, and I'm sure this is not just an African phenomenon, but I've seen it a lot in a number of African countries where church becomes not only just the solution to all your problems, especially your marital problems, but there are these new churches cropping up that are organized around vulnerable women. So you don't have a husband, you should come to my church. You want your husband to stop drinking and stop beating you up, or your children to get into a good school, or this, that, and the other. And then they have all these requirements, which is like shave off all your hair, you can't wear underwear in church, there's no men in this church, only the pastor. Just some things are a little questionable. um you're giving all your money to the church. There's women who've given all their family wealth. I know a number of aunties who've been targeted, especially if their husbands die, for example, where the pastor will be like, I had a dream where God said that you need to give me your house, and they're like, sure. So there's things like that that are questionable to me as to how that fits in. And there's a way in which there's this desperation that's developed around the importance of being married and staying married and being faithful. And I imagine that even though she probably did not grow up in that kind of a situation, but just given all the circumstances that she's been through, and that she has a daughter and she's vulnerable, they don't have her husband's protection, they're in a foreign country, they don't speak the language. She's doing her best to sort of keep her daughter safe and bring her whole and intact to finally reunite at some point. Because the upside of a lot of these communities, church communities, is that they are communities and they are support, and like people are there for you. And that's probably the one place that felt the safest to interact with people. And so she formed friendships that were probably real and meaningful. um, and when you're in desperate times, you've come out of a war and all these other things, maybe the way that you look at life is a little different. Maybe the solutions that you thought didn't mean much now suddenly really mean everything. And so what would it mean for her, especially if her husband hasn't been traveling the same path? And so that was the crutch that she developed to keep her hopeful and to keep her from being like, what, forget it, I'm gonna find another husband. It's not even worth it. She could have done that, but she didn't. um so yay, so because they got here, but what does it mean? Who got here exactly? Because it's not the Esther that he knew or we knew or Sylvia knew. Like, there's been a change, and there's been a change for Walter too. It's just, it looks different. Walter had a girlfriend. Her, you could say that she was in a relationship with Jesus, as her way of coping.
Yeah, I mean, people change so much over time. It's just like you're almost, meeting a different person who
Oh
looks
yeah,
familiar. And
absolutely. I mean, if we think about just this year that we've been on lockdown, the people that we're going to meet, given all the circumstances and all the experiences that we've all been through, not just in this country, but worldwide, I'm sure there'll be a lot of changes that we'll meet with just random everyday people, let alone your own family members. So it has a big impact, separation does, on families and on individuals.
yeah, I mean, there's this, I mean, I think I love the kind of the theme of disconnection through it, not only the disconnection with the family, but also how do we find connection with home, with culture, with our history, right, in a new place. And I feel
Yeah.
like Walter has kind of started to start to find that, and the daughter is
Mhm.
starting to maybe find that. And could you talk to us a little bit about almost your own experiences, coming to different places, and how those your own experiences tied into the characters' experiences in the film and the themes?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was born in the US. My parents were scholars. in school in California when I was born, and we left when I was 5. But at that time we were living on a college campus, and there was a African Students Union, and so I was surrounded by aunties and uncles who are all from elsewhere. Actually, the little village that we lived in, this was at Stanford, so Escondido Village had pretty much all foreign students from different parts of the world. And I just remember, at least for the parties, the African Student Union parties that my parents had, they were, just watching them like dancing to this music and being like, oh, this is the time. And oh, remember when and this is when we were wearing our mini skirts, and just like the nostalgia and the longing for, we were from Tanzania, which was not a country at war. So people could go back. And that was the plan. You came and studied and went back. But there were a lot of people from South Africa, from Southern Africa, whose countries were at war. So music and culture and food and that community had a completely different meaning, because it was that longing for, and will I ever see again? And are people even alive anymore? And, you know, I'm so frustrated with the circumstances under which I had to leave in the first place. And, just all of the layers. But that's how I, as a young person, remember learning about Africa, was through these songs, popular singers and popular. And it's interesting because I've spoken to friends from other parts of the continent who have the same songs as their memories as well. It's like, oh yeah, that one song, yeah, we all listened to that as kids, because that was, the Miriam Makeba, Harry Belafonte album or whatever it was, which was symbolic of that longing. And in my research for this film, that was the one thing that seemed to hold over as well, for like the Angolans who left and were in exile in Portugal, and whose kids were maybe born in Portugal, and they weren't sure if they would ever go back. This was their way of sort of passing on their heritage and their culture and their stories, and just all of it to their children. It was like, this is what the country meant to us, and people would cry and dance and do all of those things. So I have very vivid memories of that kind of thing, the part that Sylvia talks about in the car, of going to these parties and just watching people having this trip down memory lane. And I find it for myself too. I mean, in the digital age it's a little bit different. And also, um, again, I'm not in exile where I can't go back to my country. I can go back to my country as much as I want. So it's different for me. But for people who are in exile, for example, or who are, we're in danger, whatever the case is, like there's only a few things that you get to hold on to. And those tend to be the music, the dance, the culture, the stories, whatever pictures you might have been able to salvage, etc. And that's true for, I think, a lot of different cultures, even European people, right? um, which it carries so much weight, just hearing those bagpipes in New York. I mean, we still do bagpipes in New York, and people are like, oh, the old country. So it means a lot. And I wanted to be able to show that for this particular community, because again, it's something that we don't really converse about. You see films about Africa that have wonderful African music, because we happen to have a lot of wonderful African music on the continent, but we don't always talk about what it means. And that's something that I wanted to include as a conversation here.
That's great. And what it means also, yeah, it was what we bring with us. I love that thought of like, what are we bringing with us? And New York is such a great place to set the film, because it is kind of, we're talking about like that kind of conglomeration of all these things that people have brought with them from their homes, right? And it's just
Yeah.
kind of this kind of collage of all of that.
I
Yeah.
mean, and if you think about it too, even for like the Africans who were enslaved and brought to the Americas, it's not like they were able to pack bags. What they were able to bring is their memories, their music, their cultures, their religions. They had to hide them. A lot of the music and cultures were hidden in like language. If you study language patterns, the way that people form sentences and words, or religious practices too. You know, the receiving spirits and like all of those kinds of things that can be traced back to all sorts of different places. Um, and so it's held a lot of significance for African heritage people, I think across centuries, the importance of being able to hold on to language and music and memory, because that's all that people were able to bring, especially if you're leaving under duress. You know, you're not able to like lovingly pack together all the things that mean things to you. You just kind of have to take what you can. So I spent time in Cuba, and I've heard stories about, you know, how incantations, religious incantations, have passed down from generations in the Santeria religious culture. And then there was sort of like one of the biggest sort of Santeria priests in Cuba had a chance in the 90s to go back to Nigeria and, you know, meet sort of like the Ifa community there, and, you know, brought his best outfit and like came out with his most eloquent Yoruba speech that he, you know, sort of incantations. And everyone was just like, what is he saying? Because the words that he was using were so old. Like, no, it's, you know, because culture changes too, is the thing, right? So nobody understood what he was. It's like my great grandfather used to speak like that or used to use those words, but we don't use that anymore. But it kind of like froze still in Cuba because that's what was passed down, you know, from whoever brought it, and they were able to remember this thing and pass it. But it's still a link that they have, you know. And I think stuff like that is really interesting and beautiful.
So, Echo, what's your next project that we can look forward to seeing?
Oh man,
The one you're most
none of
excited?
them are projects that I can talk about yet.
Okay.
Um, at the moment, it's a little hard. One of the projects that I'm working on it's set in Africa. It's sort of like a legal thriller drama, let's say, and just the research that I'm doing for it right now, because it does have some dark colors to it, in terms of, you know, genocide. It's a little genocide.
That's an adjective now.
um,
Okay.
so I've been watching a lot of Holocaust movies, which I'm just like, oh my God, this is really rough. It's actually, you know, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of our history has turbulence. A lot of African heritage people's history has a lot of turbulence. And while I have a lot of feelings about balancing, you know, because we tend to get way more child soldier films than we get, you know, rom-coms and love dramas, for example. And I do think that there's a problem with that. But I also think that there are stories that deserve to be told. And so how do we tell them in a way that's not wrist slitting inducing, but can be inspirational, or, you know, can sort of have like where people have agency and they're able to, even if they are struggling with whatever it is, they still have life. You know, they're not just sitting around like, oh my God, help us. So there's a lot of things that I'm sort of having to grapple with right now and trying to figure out how to tell a story in a different way, tell an African story in a different way, and be able to show some of the things that our challenges and our struggles that we have on the continent without using the same tropes of white saviorhood or, you know, whatever. Um, and it's exciting, actually, but also exhausting at the moment, just because of the research part of it.
I feel like you're the right person to do that, to like bring all those elements together.
Thank you. I agree. Thank you.
I'm excited to see whatever it is.
Yeah.
I'm guessing this is you're like in pre-production. It sounds like you're doing research.
Yeah, I have two projects at the moment that I'm sort of lined up to do. One is we're waiting for the script. I'm not writing it, and that I'm just directing it. So we're waiting for the script to come in. And then the other one, I'm doing a rewrite and directing it. That's a little further down the line, probably next year or so. So I'm in the sort of development, imagination stage for that one.
That's the fun stage. That's a great
Yeah,
stage to be in.
yeah, it is
All
a
the
great stage.
possibilities are there.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us and sharing your thoughts with our audience. And we hope that, eventually we'll bring you back to Portland when we can all fly again and hug each other and all that.
God, please hug each other. Yes,
Soon.
I love
Very
that. I love the community in Portland, and it's wonderful to be here again. So thank you for the support and love that you've always shown.
Thank you. All right.